If you could travel back in time to the spring of 1789 and stand on the cobblestone streets of Paris, you would not smell the romantic perfume of baked baguettes or the refined sophistication of Versailles. You would smell sewage, rot, and an overwhelming, metallic tang of cold, collective desperation. France, the undisputed cultural hyperpower of Europe, was rotting from the inside out. Decades of ruinous foreign wars, extravagant royal spending, and a catastrophic string of crop failures had pushed the absolute monarchy of King Louis XVI to the brink of total financial collapse. The ordinary people, the peasants, the artisans, the laborers who made up 98% of the population, were starving. A single loaf of bread cost an entire month's wages for a working man. Yet, the nobility and the clergy, who owned the vast majority of the nation's wealth and land, paid virtually nothing in taxes. They lived in an insulated bubble of gold leaf, silk, and endless banquets inside the gilded halls of Versailles, completely oblivious to the fact that the geometric structure of French society was about to implode with the force of a thermonuclear detonation. To understand how a single nation went from absolute royal tyranny to a bloody reign of terror, and finally to an imperial superpower that brought the entire European continent to its knees, you have to look at the French Revolution not as a series of random riots, but as a massive, volatile chemical reaction. For centuries, France had been governed by the Ancien Régime, a rigid medieval class hierarchy divided into three estates. The first estate was the Catholic clergy. The second estate was the nobility. The third estate was everyone else from wealthy lawyers and merchants down to the poorest landless peasant. When Louis XVI, desperate to clear his bankrupt crown's astronomical debts, summoned the Estates General in May 1789 for the first time in 175 years, he opened a Pandora's box that no army on earth could close. The third estate, realizing that the voting system was rigged so that the first and second estates could always outvote them 2-1, broke away. They declared themselves the National Assembly, the true representatives of the French people, and swore a solemn oath on a nearby indoor tennis court never to separate until they had written a constitution for France. The tension in Paris reached a boiling point on July 14, 1789. Fearing that the king was gathering Swiss mercenary regiments to crush the newly formed National Assembly, an angry, starving mob poured into the streets. They needed gunpowder. They marched on the Bastille, a towering medieval stone fortress and political prison that stood as the ultimate symbol of royal tyranny and arbitrary state power. The assault on the Bastille was fast, chaotic, and terrifyingly violent. The mob overwhelmed the defenders, dragged the fortress governor into the streets, severed his head with a pocket knife, and paraded it through Paris on the tip of a pike. The fall of the Bastille was not just a riot, it was a psychological earthquake. It proved that the absolute monarchy was powerless against the sheer, unbridled momentum of the masses. Within weeks, the Assembly issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a revolutionary document that shattered centuries of feudal privilege by declaring that all men were born free and equal in rights. But revolutions are far easier to start than they are to control. What began as an idealistic movement for a constitutional monarchy quickly spiraled into radical madness. As foreign monarchies, terrified that the revolutionary virus would spread to their own populations, declared war on France, panic gripped Paris. The revolution was under siege from foreign armies on the outside and royalist traitors on the inside. Enter Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins, a faction of uncompromising political extremists who believed that to save the Republic, virtue without terror was completely powerless. What followed was the Reign of Terror, a 14-month dark age of paranoia, surveillance, and state-sanctioned execution. The instrument of this terror was a new, highly efficient killing machine, the guillotine. Designed as an egalitarian weapon that executed nobles and commoners alike with mathematical precision, its heavy steel blade dropped day after day in the center of Paris. King Louis XVI was sent to the scaffold in January 1793, followed months later by his queen, Marie Antoinette. Over 40,000 people were executed or murdered without fair trials across France. Paranoia reached such extreme levels that neighbors denounced neighbors just to prove their own revolutionary loyalty. But the monster of terror eventually consumed its own creator. In July 1794, Robespierre himself was overthrown, dragged to the guillotine, and executed, bringing an end to the bloodiest chapter of the revolution. France was left exhausted, fractured, bankrupt, and deeply traumatized. The government that replaced Robespierre, known as the Directory, was hopelessly corrupt, incompetent, and constantly threatened by royalist rebellions and economic collapse. France was screaming for order, for stability, for a strong hand to restore pride to a shattered nation. And from the smoky battlefields of Italy and Egypt, a young, brilliant artillery officer stepped forward to answer that call. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. Born on the rugged, newly annexed island of Corsica in 1769, Napoleon was an outsider. He spoke French with a heavy Italian accent, was ridiculed by his aristocratic classmates in military school, and had no powerful family connections. But what he lacked in social status, he made up for with a terrifyingly sharp mathematical mind, an insatiable appetite for work, and an unshakable belief in his own destiny. Unlike traditional aristocratic generals who viewed warfare as a slow, formal game of maneuvers, Napoleon viewed warfare as a science of speed, concentration, and total destruction. During the French Revolutionary Wars, he was given command of the ragged, starving French army of Italy. In a single campaign, he shattered the combined armies of Austria and Piedmont, using rapid night marches, inner lines of communication, and devastatingly concentrated artillery fire to defeat enemy forces twice his size. He didn't just win battles, he annihilated his opponents psychologically. By November 1799, the 30-year-old general realized that the corrupt Directory was ripe for picking. In a swift, bloodless military coup, known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire, Napoleon seized power, establishing himself as first consul of France. 5 years later, in December 1804, inside the Cathedral of Notre Dame, Napoleon took the imperial crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placed it upon his own head, declaring himself Emperor of the French. France had come full circle, from an absolute monarchy, through the fires of radical republicanism, to a military empire ruled by a single man. As emperor, Napoleon did not merely fight wars, he completely rebuilt the structural foundation of the modern world. He implemented the Napoleonic Code, a brilliant, unified legal system that abolished feudalism, guaranteed religious freedom, established legal equality for all men, and protected private property. This legal code was so revolutionary that it remains the basis of civil law in dozens of countries across the globe today. He overhauled the French education system, centralized the economy, created the Bank of France, and established a meritocracy where men were promoted based on talent and bravery, rather than noble birth. But Napoleon's grand domestic vision was constantly threatened by the monarchies of Europe, led by Great Britain, who viewed him as an illegitimate usurper who had to be erased from history. What followed was a decade of legendary military campaigns that reshaped the map of Europe. The European powers formed coalition after coalition to crush him, but Napoleon consistently shattered them. His absolute masterpiece came in December 1805 at the Battle of Austerlitz, also known as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Outnumbered by a combined Russo-Austrian army commanded by Tsar Alexander I and Emperor Francis II, Napoleon pulled off the greatest tactical trap in military history. He deliberately weakened his right flank, feigning fear and vulnerability to entice the Allied forces to attack. As the Russian and Austrian commanders took the bait and poured their troops down off the strategic Pratzen Heights to crush his right wing, Napoleon launched a lightning counterattack straight up the center, cutting the Allied army in half and crushing them completely. Austerlitz destroyed the Third Coalition and shattered the Holy Roman Empire, cementing Napoleon's reputation as an invincible military genius. At its peak in 1812, the Grand Empire of Napoleon stretched from the sun-drenched beaches of Spain to the borders of Poland. Over 44 million people were ruled directly or indirectly by Paris. Napoleon placed his brothers and marshals on the thrones of Europe, creating a network of client states that fed the French war machine. But hubris is the ultimate trap of military conquerors. Napoleon's downfall began not with a brilliant enemy strategy, but in the rugged, sun-baked hills of the Iberian Peninsula and the freezing, desolate steppes of Russia. In Spain, Napoleon found himself bogged down in a brutal, asymmetric conflict known as the Peninsular War. Spanish civilians, horrified by the French occupation, launched a vicious underground war of ambushes, hit-and-run attacks, and brutal reprisals, a new kind of warfare that gave birth to the Spanish word for little war, guerrilla. Backed by British forces under the Duke of Wellington, the Spanish ulcer bled the French army white, trapping over 300,000 of Napoleon's finest troops in an endless, unwinnable quagmire. Then came the fatal mistake. In June 1812, angry that Tsar Alexander I had broken the continental trade blockade against Britain, Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, a massive, multinational force of over 600,000 men, and invaded Russia. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen, but the Russians refused to play by Napoleon's rules. Instead of engaging in a decisive, large-scale battle where Napoleon's tactical genius could win the day, the Russian forces constantly retreated deeper into their vast interior, executing a brutal, scorched-earth policy. They burned their own crops, slaughtered their own livestock, and poisoned their own wells, leaving nothing behind for the advancing French army to eat. Napoleon reached Moscow in September 1812, after the horrific, bloody bloodbath at the Battle of Borodino, expecting Tsar Alexander to offer his surrender. Instead, he found Moscow deserted, and within hours, Russian agents set the wooden city ablaze. Napoleon was trapped in the ashes of a burning capital with no supplies, surrounded by a hostile wilderness as the brutal Russian winter began to settle in. The subsequent retreat from Moscow is one of the greatest military tragedies in human history. As temperatures plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, the Grande Armée disintegrated. Soldiers froze to death where they walked, starved in the snow, or were cut down by ruthless Cossack cavalry raiding their flanks. Out of the 600,000 men who had proudly marched into Russia, fewer than 50,000 ragged, frostbitten survivors stumbled back across the border. Sense of blood in the water, the monarchies of Europe united in the Sixth Coalition. Despite raising a new army of young French recruits and winning incredible tactical victories in Germany, France was exhausted, outnumbered, and surrounded on all sides. In April 1814, after Allied forces marched into Paris, Napoleon was forced to abdicate his throne. He was exiled to the small Mediterranean island of Elba, and the Bourbon monarchy was restored to France in the person of Louis XVIII. But Napoleon was not finished. In March 1815, in one of the most astonishing comebacks in history, Napoleon escaped Elba with a tiny guard of 1,000 men and landed on the southern coast of France. King Louis XVIII sent the French 5th Regiment of Infantry to intercept and arrest him. As the soldiers lined up with loaded muskets raised, Napoleon walked out in front of his old troops alone, opened his gray coat, and shouted, "If there is any soldier among you who would shoot his emperor, here I am." The soldiers broke ranks, wept, and shouted, "Vive l'Empereur!" Within weeks, Napoleon marched back into Paris without firing a single shot, driving the Bourbon king into exile and reclaiming his empire in a period known as the 100 Days. The final act was played out on a rain-soaked field in modern-day Belgium on the 18th of June, 1815, the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon faced an Anglo-Allied army commanded by the Duke of Wellington and a Prussian army led by Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher. It was a brutal, grinding battle of attrition. For hours, French heavy cavalry smashed themselves against the unyielding British infantry squares, while the mud slowed down the deployment of French artillery. As the sun began to set, the arrival of the Prussian army on Napoleon's flank proved decisive. Napoleon hurled his ultimate reserve, the undefeated, legendary Imperial Guard, into the center of Wellington's line, but the Allied infantry held firm and repulsed them. For the first time in history, the Imperial Guard broke and retreated. Panic spread through the French lines. La Garde, recule. The French army dissolved into a total rout. Napoleon was captured by the British and exiled to the most remote, isolated rock in the Atlantic Ocean, the island of St. Helena, over 1,000 miles from the nearest mainland. There, under the watchful eye of a British garrison, the man who had reshaped the Western world spent his final 6 years writing his memoirs, carefully crafting his own legend, before dying in May 1821 at the age of 51. The legacy of this chaotic, brilliant, and bloody era is woven into the very fabric of our modern world. The French Revolution proved that human societies are not bound by divine right or ancient feudalism. It showed that ordinary citizens possess the power to dismantle broken systems and demand fundamental human rights. Napoleon Bonaparte took those revolutionary ideals, stripped away the chaotic madness of the Reign of Terror, and codified them into an administrative, legal, and educational blueprint that transformed modern statehood. From the metric system to modern civil law, from the concept of total war to the rise of modern nationalism, the fires that burned in Paris and across the battlefields of Europe over 2 centuries ago are still shaping the way we live, govern, and think today.